JP. Welcome to MasterMusicMethod.com, the first video in the fiddle directory, and this video is our info and history segment. You'll see what I just played was a short medley of not only tunes but styles. The first three tunes were Cape Breton / Scottish in origin, and came from the playing of a gentleman named Winston Fitzgerald, who we'll explore as we go forward. The second tune was called, I believe, the Headlight Reel, I think. I took that from the playing of Carl Elliott, one of Canada's greatest old-time fiddlers. And then the last tune I played was an American tune called Sally Gooden. Now, the reason I did that was to demonstrate something, that those are the three styles that I'm proficient in, have had success in, although I have dabbled around in playing country music, which is just really another form of bluegrass maybe, and some jazz and some this and that, and you apply your style where you need to. But I played three styles in succession, and not many fiddlers can actually do that, and the reason I can do it is because I learned each style as its own encapsulated animal. There's only the only differences between the styles are the bowing and ornamentation. So when I started out, I also think it has to do with the order that I learned them in. When I started out, was obviously heavily influenced by Cape Breton fiddle, because my father was a fiddler, and my uncle Joe Cormier was a fiddler, my father's brother, and I was continually inundated with Winston records. We had all of Winston's LPs, and it was the first thing I really heard on the fiddle. But the other things that drew me in were the playing of Don Messer, because he was on television when I was a kid, and his playing is often called old-time music, and that led me to people like Graham Townsend and Al Cherney. Those three people specifically as a child I heard and thought, wow, that's really cool stuff. It's a whole other groove from Cape Breton. And then in later life, as I grew into my teens, I was in the United States and ran into players like Kenny Baker and Red Murphy and Stuart Duncan, Mark O'Connor, like all these American fiddlers. And the order that this occurred in was old time, Cape Breton, American. And as I learned those three styles, there was parts of every style that got, well, all the parts were mastered, and then the parts that were the best of those styles got put into the JP pot. So I can play the three styles independently without having them affect each other. So I can play bluegrass without sounding like I'm a Cape Bretoner. I can play Cape Bretoner without sounding like I'm an old-time fiddle champion. I can play old-time without sounding Cape Breton, etc., etc. Keeping the styles separate is sort of a unique talent. Not many people can do it, but I think if you'd learned the way that I did, you could do it. So that's how we're going to teach you to play the fiddle. And so we're going to start with what I started with, which was old-time music. A lot of people pshaw old-time fiddling, but the greatest fiddlers that we had through the 30s, through the 60s, Don Messer and Al Cherney and Graham Townsend, and there's a slew of others, King Ganem, and just a ton of them. There's too many to list. The Elliots, the Elliott brothers, the original Elliott, Carl Elliott and his brothers, Gerald and Ace, and like there's so many players. It's a huge body of music, and it only occurs in Canada. That's what's really amazing about it, and it's a mixture of French and Scottish music, what they call Quebecois fiddling, another style altogether, which was pretty well invented by a guy named Tijan Carignan from Montreal, who was probably one of the greatest violinists that ever lived. He was a violinist, even though he played trad music. People like Jascha Heifetz and Yehudi Menuhin said he was the greatest fiddler that ever walked the earth. The old-time style has got all that in it, and The main thing it has in it is technique, the technique of cleanliness and bow control. You'll notice, maybe if you watch that video, the playing part of this video again, you'll see that when I played Cape Breton music, my bow grip was different. I hold the bow with 2 fingers when I play the Cape Breton style, like Winston did, and Jerry Holland, and Howie MacDonald, and all of these players on the island all hold their bow like this, very loosely, but with a lot of downward pressure. But when I ran into old-time music, the fingers came down on the stick. It's a different grip because it's a different delivery. Whole other thing altogether, so the bow grip has to change. And then in the American part of the medley, the bow grip didn't change, but the swing of the bow changes. The way they deliver their music, and a lot of double stops and all the things that happens in American playing. So we're going to stop there for just a second, and I want to go back and just talk about the violin, because I did this. We're going to do this for every instrument. The violin is a very fascinating instrument because it hasn't been around that long. If you go back and watch the guitar videos, I talked to you about carvings that occurred in Old Testament times of the Hittites and different peoples who made carvings of people playing an instrument that looked just like a guitar. The violin has only been around for about 500 years. It started out in the early 1500s in Italy. And there were other bowed instruments before the violin, but they weren't like this. They only had 2 strings, but they were basically the same premise. They were strung with gut, catgut or sheep gut, and always a bow, not ones that looked like this, mind you, but the same idea, a wooden stick with horse's hair, the tail of a horse, strung between a frog and a tip. And that was drawn across the strings to make the sound. So that hasn't changed, but the violin as we know it started early 1500s, and there was 2 main makers that built instruments in those days that pretty well changed the violin world forever: Stradivarius and Guarneri. Those 2 men made the violin look like it does today, and it has not changed in 500 years because their version of the instrument was so perfect that all other makers after them just strive to make a fiddle as good as they did. And so it's a very young instrument, and it's been in its initial early stages. It was used, of course, for Baroque music, which was a very primitive form of classical music. Well, primitive until Bach came along, and then it became very complex, and composers like him forced the use of violins, which were more expressive, and as they were built, they changed. Baroque violins often had another set of strings underneath these that you didn't touch, but they vibrated and were tuned, and they called them sympathetic strings. So you'd bow one note, and those other strings underneath would vibrate and create almost like a chord or a second voice. So you'd have two different voices coming from one instrument. And so from Italy, it made its way west and through the realms of classical music and into the hands of the Celts in Scotland, who were probably the other best known Scottish violinists in the world. The Scots took the violin to new heights by copying or trying to emulate the sound of bagpipes. And so there was a whole catalog of music created by the Scots, like the stuff I played on the very first of the medley, that it just became its own style of music altogether, Scottish fiddling. And when the clearances happened in the in the mid-1700s, and actually several times, these Scots ended up here in Canada on Cape Breton Island, and they brought that original ancient music with them, not only the music of the pipes, but the music of the famous fiddlers of the day who composed music for violin, like Neil Coe, the collectors like William Marshall. There's just tons of history there as well that we will go into as the lessons progress. And so the violin landed in Cape Breton with all this music attached to it, and the French landed a little while later. They had music attached to them too, this traditional French dancing music, and the two styles sort of melded together also with the help of the natives in Cape Breton Island, the Mi'kmaq Indians, who were musical to begin with, and they got a hold of fiddles and started translating the Scottish music the way they would hear it and play it. And so Cape Breton style violin playing was born out of all these three cultures, and didn't really make it back into Scotland until the 70s and 80s, when Cape Breton violinists like Buddy McMaster, John Morris Rankin, Jerry Holland, a host of others started to go over to Scotland and tour. And so we were actually bringing back the old music that hadn't been there since the clearances back to Scotland, along with the step dancing, which was also taken out of Scotland by the clearances. Basically, when they threw all the poor people out of Scotland, they took the music with them. And so if we follow it from there, which is such a massive history, if we follow it from there, it also went southwest into the United States, as well as the Irish who were landing in New York, all brought fiddles. They all played fiddle. That went down into the Appalachian of the United States and became what we know today as American fiddling, or bluegrass fiddling, or old-time, like mountain fiddling. People like Tommy Jarrell and Kenny Baker and Howdy Forrester and Chubby Wise, and there's another 100 players that took that emulation of old music and assimilating it into other types of folk music, and yet another style was created in the trad sense. All the while, classical music has survived as well. So, and then another jump across another side of the coin are people like Stefan Grappelli, who took violin in the early 20s and 30s, 40s into the realm of jazz, which had really never been done before. So, in other words, we have a very amazing instrument that fits in so many different categories, and I believe it's because the instrument is so expressive. Had a conversation with a sound man not long ago about how I wanted to present my fiddle on stage, whether I was going to plug it in or put a mic in front of it or whatever. And he offered me a very expensive instrument mic, and I said, no, I just want to put a vocal mic in front of it, an SM57, or 58, I'm sorry. And he was like, why would you do that? I said, well, because the violin is just like a human voice. And it's true. The fiddle sounds better through a vocal mic on stage than anything else, because it is definitely expressive. It has a huge range like a human voice does. It's sort of in our vocal range somehow, in a weird sort of way, and it can do anything. Now, mind you, it's one of the hardest instruments to play, if not the hardest. And it's also the instrument that's least forgiving if you don't practice. So if you learn something on the violin and you get really good at it, and you don't practice for 5 or 6 months, your chances are you're going to lose it, and you'll have to start not from scratch, but somewhere at that level, about 20% where you started from. You really have to practice if you're going to play the violin, and because it is incredibly difficult. It is not a fretted instrument, obviously. Where you're putting your fingers on a violin is derived strictly from muscle memory and having a good ear. So you have to be able to tell what's in tune and what's not in tune. And just a bevy of things about the violin that makes it completely different than any other stringed instrument. You don't play it with a pick. You don't hang it over your shoulder. But it's such a popular instrument also for the same reasons I spoke on guitar. Guitar is very portable. Violin's even more portable. So early on in its life, the violin became the instrument of bards and buskers and street performers, and you could just put it in a sack and throw it over your back and go anywhere with it. It didn't weigh anything. They're very light, and it became a great communicator through music, same as the guitar has become in these modern times. The violin was doing it in a bigger way earlier than I think the guitar ever did. So as I said earlier, as we move forward and continue exploring the history of the instrument, and you're going to find this about every instrument that we do, looking backwards is the easiest way to move forwards with everything you do in your whole life, probably. If you look back behind and see how things were done 50 years ago, chances are that information is not being paid much attention to these days. People are always looking to do the next big thing, or they're emulating or copying somebody who also hasn't looked back and just made their own style out of thin air. And that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But the best way to be in touch with where the music comes from and how it's played and how it's supposed to sound and how it feels and all the things that make up playing on any instrument, you have to go back. You have to go back and look at the very first people who did it, the very first recordings, the very first composers, how they put medleys of tunes together, how they... all of these things that are all contained in the history of the music, and that's contained in recordings. And I'll be playing recordings in these videos just to give you examples of how things sounded and were played, not only on fiddle, but all the instruments in the series. But the main thing we'll do for violin, because it's such a unique instrument and I learned it in such an odd way, is that we will be going through, in order, how I stumbled upon the violin, which is to start with old-time music and then delve into the Cape Breton style and then into the American style. And I'll show you how the cleanliness and timing of old-time music carried forward, and intonation too. Old-time music has to be in tune. They play very, very, very much in tune. People like Don Messer and Graham Townsend, intonation was unbelievably accurate. And which means the notes they played were all in tune. They didn't play sour notes. The fingers were always in the right place all the time. I took that information into Cape Breton music and Scottish Celtic music, and I took the intonation from that and some of the timings, the attack of the bow and stuff, and I moved that over to Cape Breton music, and then I figured out all the ornamentation of Cape Breton music, which is a massive, massive library that you could take in a lifetime to figure it all out. But I'm going to show it to you in a very condensed form so you can learn it more quickly. And every player, the best players in the world, and there's not many of them, are the ones who manage to take the entire catalog of Cape Breton ornamentation and use all of it at some point in time during their performance. Those are the best players in the world. When you get below that, you get players that rely too much on just one or two, three, four different kind of ornaments, and the playing becomes monotonous and it starts to sound the same. And the guys who are the best, like Winston, Angus Chisholm, Jerry Holland, Howie MacDonald, Dwayne Cote, these gentlemen have a working knowledge of the entire catalog of the possibilities of ornamenting a note in a tune, and they use the whole thing all the time. And so then, from Cape Breton music, I gained a whole lot of left-hand strength and a better understanding of the neck playing up in position. Some Cape Breton music is very difficult and challenging technically. So then when I moved into American music, I had the intonation. I had incredible bow chops because Cape Breton music is full of bow work. And so when I started to learn American music, I realized that I needed a more beautiful and thicker vibrato, as opposed to a quick vibrato, which sounds like people just shake their hand really, really fast, and that's sort of a trad Cape Breton vibrato. But in bluegrass, they use a big, thick, especially people like Mark O'Connor, use a big, thick, slow vibrato. So I took I learned that and learned double stopping, and which was already sort of present in Cape Breton music, and had all the chops from old times, so I wasn't scared by the form of tunes or the complexity of the American tunes, as I had all that already with the two styles. So I learned American, and then I took the vibrato that I learned in American style and run it back through the first two styles. So my old-time fiddling get really sweet and thick and syrupy. The vibrato worked in Cape Breton as well, and so there was this massive cross-pollination between the three styles that affected all three. As I learned one, it set me off to the second one. That stuff improved the first one, the third one improved the first two, and then the style began to emerge, or how I play. And that's how you're going to learn. We're going to go through any number of exercises and tunes and techniques that will kind of grow you the same way that I was grown as a player. So that's it for this segment of the history info. There's a lot more on violin. I encourage you to go get information, Google violins and Google the builders and the early composers, and listen to classical music, because that's pretty well the highest form of what a violin does. And when you hear it, it just boggles the mind, because it's so far above what we call fiddle music. Oh, and by the way, there's probably a lot of those out there that are wondering what the difference is between a fiddle and a violin. That question's asked a million times. There is no difference between a fiddle and a violin. It's the music that's played on it. So if I was playing classical music and using that sort of technique, which is a whole other world from fiddling, I would be a violinist. But I am actually a fiddler. I play fiddle music, although some of the technique I use to play fiddle music is brought in from the violin realm. So, and the only other difference might be that classical violins have a slightly higher cut bridge, because they need more space for the bow, for the moves that happen in classical music. Other than that, it's the same exact instrument, same bow, same everything. So there you go. There's your intro and history to the violin, and I hope you found it interesting. And make sure you feel free always on this site to go back and watch things over and over and over again. You have access to everything on the site, so make sure you take advantage of that. Go back and listen to things 2 or 3 times, and as you do that, I'm sure that there'll be things that I say and do that will start to click, especially as you actually start to play and learn. Some things that I said way back here may affect how you see the current lesson that you're in down the road 8, 9, 10 videos from now. So make sure you always go back and take full advantage of your access to the site and to all this information. Thanks for being here with me on mastermusicmethod.com, and our next video will be maintenance and tech for violin in this directory. Thank you.